Welcome to the Low Countries Radio, a collaboration between Republic of Amsterdam Radio and the Low Countries website, celebrating Flemish and Dutch history and culture and its impact on the world today.
Welcome to the Low Countries Radio. Today we have a special version of the show in which we are going to chat with author and academic Christine Kooi. Her book, Reformation in the Low Countries, 1500 to 1620, was released last year by Cambridge University Press. As its title suggests, the book encompasses a vast and tumultuous period which served to greatly shape the modern nations of Belgium and the Netherlands. It is a sweeping and extremely useful narrative. And we are lucky enough today to have Christine join us online from her home in the US to help us unpack it all. Hello, Christine.
Hello, gentlemen. It's nice to talk to you.
Wonderful to have you here. Thank you very much for joining us. And could you just introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. My name's Christine Kooi. I am the Price Professor of European History at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in the U.S. And I specialize, my area of expertise is the Reformation in the Low Countries.
You are American, but your name suggests you have Dutch roots.
Yes, my parents, who were Dutch, emigrated to Canada in the 1950s. They were part of that big post-war migration. So I was born in Canada, but when I was 3 years old, we emigrated again to the United States. And so I'm sort of Canadian-American, one could say.
Okay. And has this served to influencing your chosen line of study, or is it a pure coincidence?
No, it's quite influential. I grew up in a bilingual household. I grew up in a Dutch Calvinist household, and I think all of that imprinted itself on me. And so when I was in grad school and the time came to select a dissertation topic, I thought since I already had the advantage of the language, I would explore various Reformation themes in the Low Countries.
Yeah, wonderful. So that was growing up with written and spoken bilingualism.
Well, more spoken than written. The way it works out, and this is typical in immigrant families, is our parents would speak to us in Dutch and we would answer back in English. So when I first went to the Netherlands to do archival research for my book, I had to actually read the documents out loud under my breath so I understood what they were saying, because my whole understanding of Dutch was through my ears.
He's brilliant. Your recent book, let's talk about it. Reformation in the Low Countries, 1500 to 1620. It is, I said in the intro, a sweeping narrative, very useful as well, just to let you know. Mm-hmm. It covers a century of religious and political turmoil. What made you decide to write this book, and why now?
Well, it's a book that has been needed to be written for a long time. There is at least a half century's, even longer, worth of scholarship on the Reformation of the Low Countries that really opened up starting after the Second World War, when it kind of got shaken loose from its very Protestant origins. And since the 1940s, really, there's been just a huge amount of research done by scholars in Belgium, the Netherlands, in the UK, in North America, particularly on local aspects of the Reformation in the Low Countries, because the local archives are so rich. And it's been great. We've learned a lot from these very localized studies, but I came to conclude about 10 years ago that it was time for someone to try and provide a synthesis for all of these wonderful studies. And so, and I have colleagues who are not specialists in the Low Countries who kept asking me for recommendations of a good overview of the Reformation in the Low Countries. And I said, well, there really isn't one. There's a few articles here and there. But I decided after about 25 years in the business, I was at a point in my career where I could try to offer an overview.
Did you come and do more archival research on top of the localized stuff that had been happening?
No, this was not an archival book. This was a book that tried to synthesize the work of other historians. So it's a narrative history of of religious change in the Low Countries in the 16th century, depending primarily or resting primarily on the work of lots and lots of other scholars, some of whom I've known personally, also to a certain extent my own work. But this was not meant to be an archival book. This was an overview of what the state of the literature is and what we know about the Reformation based on that literature.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the narrative. You start your book referencing the first burning of heretics in the Low Countries in Brussels in July 1523.
Right.
Can you tell us about those two men a bit and why you chose to begin your book with them?
Those two men, Johannes van Essen those two, they were two Augustinian monks, and they were burned. They were burned at the stake in the Grand Place of Brussels in the 1st of July, 1523, so just over 500 years ago, because they held Lutheran beliefs. And I chose that moment to begin the narrative because to me it's very emblematic of all of the themes of the Reformation in the Low Countries. Most especially what was distinctive about it, which was that religious dissidents endured a great deal of legal persecution because of their beliefs. And that started very early on. The Habsburgs already by 1520 are banning Lutheran books. And the execution of Voss and van den Essen was meant to be a kind of deterrent. This was a very elaborately staged ceremony that had high prelates and the Lord mayors and Habsburg officials there to send a signal to anyone who was deemed a heretic that this was the consequence of dissent.
That was only, 5 years after the famous, often cited start of the Reformation being Luther's
Right.
action.
Mhm.
But it's not a very long period of time. Could you tell us a little bit about what the conditions of the Low Countries were just prior to the beginning of the Reformation and in those very early years?
Well, the early 1500s, the Low Countries was a very teeming and rich place. It was economically quite powerful because it stood at the center of all sorts of European trade routes. The city of Antwerp was the biggest in Northern Europe, and it was a huge marketplace for not just goods from all over the world, but also ideas. It was a printing center. And so it was a hub of all kinds of interaction. So the Low Countries is relatively highly urbanized compared to the rest of Europe, but it has a kind of double or split personality because the Western Low Countries, places like Holland and Zeeland, Flanders, Brabant, that's the Western urbanized maritime part of the Low Countries. But then you have an Eastern Low Countries that includes places like Groningen and all the way down south to Limburg and Luxembourg that were much more rural, much more agricultural, and we see a lot less evidence of what will eventually become dissenting ideas there. So the Low Countries stands at this corner of Europe, this metropolis, really, this very cosmopolitan place, relatively well off, relatively literate too. It's open to all sorts of ideas, and that makes it pretty ripe for eventually dissenting ideas as well.
And you would put a big emphasis on the divide between the urban and the rural areas in the fomenting of those ideas.
I think so. The circulation, the evidence that we have, the circulation of those ideas are really in the West, the Western Maritime Netherlands, and to a far lesser degree than in what is now, for example, Walloon, Belgium. Although places like Tournai in southern Belgium were hotbeds of religious dissent. So, but in those rural areas, we see less. The Reformation in the Low Countries was very much an urban event, I think.
So prior to the Reformation, how were they going about showing their devotion? And let's say we're in the urban areas, in the urban West, how would that have changed in those early years as these dissonant ideas begin to emerge?
Well, there was a very rich late medieval religious culture that existed in the Low Countries, just like in the rest of Europe. There's a kind of myth about the Reformation that it was a reaction to a decaying, dying, corrupt church, whereas in fact, all the evidence suggests that late medieval Catholicism was quite vital. People were avidly participating in it. Lay people were going on processions, they were going to the sacraments, they were joining confraternities. If they had means, they would endow buildings and chapels. I mean, all the evidence we have points to a very lively religious culture. And that's important because really reformations or religious schisms don't happen when people are indifferent to religion. They happen when people have a stake in it. And so the very fact that these all these Netherlanders in the very early 1500s are avidly, enthusiastically partaking in the religious culture of their time just makes it that much riper for questions that some will start to pose, certainly by 1517, 1518, about whether that religious culture could be improved in some way or could do better.
So we also often look at late medieval or early modern society having gone through this class division. We've got the three main classes of society, and one of them being the clergy. What was the role of the clergy? In your book, you say that the levels of devotion and competence varied across the board, but there was constantly this thing that they were a privileged caste, and so open to suspicion. And could you just talk a little bit about that? How complaints against the clergy worked, what their roles were, all these sort of things?
Sure. Well, the clergy, in traditional late medieval society, the clergy are referred to as the first estate, those who pray. And their task in late medieval society is indeed to pray for the souls of Christendom. And they are the religious professionals. They have a special ordained status, which means that they are the only ones allowed to celebrate the sacraments of the church. And the sacraments are the principal means by which God's grace is conveyed, according to the church's teaching. So they have that special status and that special privilege to begin with. Now, with that ordained status came all kinds of legal privileges for clergy as well. They were often exempt from paying certain kinds of taxes. There were certain monasteries that had rights and privileges to, for example, brew beer. The clergy, if they were accused of crimes, would be tried in their own church courts rather than in the civic courts of a secular society. So they are a privileged group, but they're also a very necessary group for the whole system to work. And I think it was the privilege of the clergy is one of the things that ultimately, at least the Protestants, start to attack. That this privilege was in fact an obstacle, or was becoming an obstacle, at least in the minds of some very serious Christians, to their devotion to God. So, and I wouldn't say that this was true all over Europe. I mean, it wasn't just the Low Countries. There was always a certain degree of sort of social resentment about the clergy as this distinct caste of people. On the other hand, the whole religious show couldn't go on without them. And so they are both necessary and resented at the same time.
And does that, so I believe you say that 2/3 of the original evangelicals, or the early evangelicals, were part of the clergy?
That is correct. That's the interesting thing. The very earliest evangelicals who emerge in the Low Countries, actually not just the Low Countries, but the very earliest ones are clergy. They are, monks, like the two men burned to death in Brussels. Martin Luther was a monk. In other words, it was Catholic clergy who very much got this show rolling, because these were the religious professionals who, or at least some of them, took it very seriously. And they, at least in the 1520s, a lot of them were in the forefront of questioning how the church was doing what it was doing. And not necessarily in the sense of wanting to break away or reject, but just very fundamental questions about the church's practices. And those questions about practice started also to bleed into questions about belief and what the church taught. So yes, you're right. The clergy were very much at the forefront of the very early Reformation.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So how about relations between clergy and the third class, the commoners, the people, and let's put ourselves in an urban setting, as
Okay.
you've outlined. How would that relationship have looked? Obviously different in different places, but we're really interested in how what kind of complaints there were against the clergy,
Mhm.
and how people would have gone about filing these complaints.
Well, it's not like there was like an ombudsman who could take their objections. Some of the ways that people like ordinary urban folk in the Low Countries might take out their resentment or might express their criticism, a very common way was just a kind of cultural mockery of clergy and monks. I mean, the number of jokes and plays and poems written about monks and priests who did not live up to their vows was quite common. The chambers of rhetoric, for example, in the Flemish and Brabant cities, routinely put on plays that just made fun of the clergy. But making fun of the clergy was something everybody did. Right? It was a commonplace. What some of these early evangelicals did was take it a step further and say, well, it's less about the corruption of the clergy or the failings, the moral failings of the clergy, and much more about whether the whole institution as a system, which the clergy serve and direct, whether that whole system needed fundamental questioning and reshaping. So.
So, what was it about the Low Countries at that time that allowed this to catch fire as it did?
Well, that's a good question. In the Reformation only succeeds ultimately where political authorities support it. And I think in the case of the Low Countries, there was a lot of sympathy among the powers that be, that is, urban magistrates, mayors and aldermen, also to a certain extent local nobles, so the two political elites of Netherlandish society. There was a certain degree of sympathy for the criticisms leveled against the church. And that sympathy got manifested early on. I mean, and the Antwerp magistrates, for example, tended to just take a blind eye to whatever kinds of dissenting groups were meeting in their city, and there were even a few magistrates who actively supported it. So, in the case of the Low Countries, there was already this kind of pre-built-in sympathy towards the notion of reform, that the church could do better, not necessarily sympathy for the notion of rebellion or dissent. But the problem is by the time we get to the 1530s, reform, or the desire for reform, is increasingly associated, at least in the minds of Catholic authorities, with rebellion and heresy. So I think the Low Countries is very fertile ground to begin with culturally for these reforming ideas.
Yeah, and to become, as you explained, what German historians were calling a Wildwuchs.
Yeah. That's a concept first developed by a couple of German historians. This Wildwuchs is a German phrase for a sort of wild growth, and what we see happening in the 1520s and then in the 1530s, mostly in the Holy Roman Empire and Switzerland, but also to a certain extent in the Low Countries, is this rather explosive growth and circulation of what were becoming increasingly radical dissenting ideas. Not just, the clergy are failing, or not just criticisms of clerical behavior, but now people like Luther, people like Melchior Hoffman, the Anabaptist leader, are actively arguing that no, there has to be this much deeper change, that the church has to be reformed, reshaped in some very fundamental ways. Right. And so in the Low Countries by the 1530s, for example, you have a very radical religious reform movement in the form of the Melchiorites, the followers of Melchior Hoffman, who have come to believe, like a lot of other people, that sometime in the 1530s the world was going to end, that the apocalypse was coming, that a new Jerusalem had to be founded. Luther himself has shared similarly apocalyptic ideas, certainly in the latter decades of his life. So it was this very charged time where all sorts of ideas are brooded about what exactly it means to be a Christian. And people are listening to preachers, they're listening to prophets, and then authorities in turn are reacting to what they see as very dangerous dissent. But you get this growth, fueled partly by the printing press, but also by a lot of itinerant preachers who all come to believe that, well, something's going to happen, and we need to bring about a fundamental reformation of not just the church, but now society as well.
So that apocalyptic belief coupled with the clergy being exposed a little bit and
Mhm.
ordinary people able to say that, I am a
Right.
priest. Is that what you're talking about? That was happening.
Yeah, well, there's kind certainly think in the case of Luther and these radicals by the 1520s and 30s, there's a rebellion against the first estate. That is a rebellion against what was seen as the too great authority of the clergy. That this and the criticism was that this privileged caste of people is now standing between Christians and God, Christian souls and God, rather than being the conduit to between, or the intermediary between God and Christians that the church taught they were. Right. So this attack on the clergy is, in some ways, the early Reformation can be seen as a kind of rebellion against the first estate and its power. I mean, that's so then you have phrases like the priesthood of all believers, right? And you have Anabaptist movements that do away with clergy entirely and effectively say everybody is a prophet, or at least every man is a prophet.
Well, let's talk about the Anabaptists,
Okay,
because of
well, they're a
course,
wild and woolly bunch.
yeah. Well, you get to that period and you talk about rebellion, and so could you just explain a little bit, briefly, who the Anabaptists were, and what became of them during this period?
Sure. Well, Anabaptism is an umbrella term to use to describe a category of religious dissenter that really emerges in the mid 1520s and into the 1530s, who don't most of them they don't think Luther or Zwingli and Zurich have gone far enough in their call of reforms. These are people who are characterized by a fairly extreme biblicism. That is, they take the Bible very seriously, but also in many cases very literally. So, for example, a very common belief among the different Anabaptist groups was that uh, a person must be baptized as a Christian as an adult, because nowhere in the Bible is a child baptized. Right? Infant baptism was a very common practice from the early church onwards. And for these guys to go around saying, well, no, you have to be baptized as a believer rather than as an unknowing infant, that rattled a lot of cages. So that was part of it. But again, there's a sort of extreme diversity among these groups. A lot of them believe that, for example, that because Jesus says at one point in the Gospel of Matthew, don't swear by anything on heaven or in earth, that they should not take oaths. Becomes one of their practices, which is also very radical in a society, the 16th century, that was very dependent on oath taking for its kind of social and legal traffic. So there, and then things like a lot of them were pacifists, not all of them, but some of them were pacifists. A lot of them believed that Christians should not hold any kind of public office. Right. So they were very radical in their beliefs. Again, they did away with clergy. They did away with liturgy. They preached from the Bible. They had prophets that they followed, and they preached a kind of radical equality among Christian souls that most contemporaries found quite unsettling, including the more mainstream Protestant reformers, as well, of course, as the Catholic authorities.
You make it very clear from early on that we shouldn't ever look at this as unified groups doing any one thing, and yet we talk about the Anabaptists like this. They gained a confessional identity over time, or would you say that they always remained quite
Yeah,
disparate?
they do eventually, because in 1534 and 35, a Melchiorite group take over the city of Münster in the eastern, what's now Western Germany, then part of the Holy Roman Empire. And they tried to create, a lot of the leaders of that group were Dutch, and they tried to create a theocracy out of Münster, the famous Anabaptist kingdom, that was eventually conquered by a combination of actually Catholic and Lutheran troops. And Münster was routinely held up by all sides, all non-Anabaptist sides, as well. These are the wages of heresy. This is what happens when you get this extreme, radical, communist, polygamist, all the bad things happen in Münster. So what happens in the second half of the 1530s and into the 1540s after Münster is that the various Anabaptist movements, and you're right, there's a great diversity among them, they start to go underground. They get quieter. A lot of them lose their militancy. They lose a lot of their social agenda in some ways as well. And the best example of that evolution is a person like Menno Simons, who was an Anabaptist leader who in the 1540s proposed a kind of Anabaptism, often referred to as Mennonitism, or the Doopsgezinde stream, that argued for, rather than this kind of aggressive stance in the world, true Christian believers should take a more passive, self-segregating role. And so Menno Simons and the Mennonites and the Doopsgezinde, but certainly by the 1540s and 1550s and 1560s, develop a kind of character, a kind of confessional character that is more quietist, is not interested in social revolution, but also tries to segregate believers from what they see as an excessively sinful world.
Material
right.
sin.
And they are heavily persecuted by the Habsburg authorities, and so they end up creating a martyrological tradition for themselves that reinforces their sense of identity. They come up with their own Bible translation as well. In other words, they start doing things that start to separate them, that create boundaries between them and other types of Christians, right? And that's what's happening in the second half of the 16th century, is this kind of overall effort to draw more boundaries between different groups of believers.
Okay. And in early days, it seems that the Anabaptist movement was very concentrated on this sort of middle artisanal class of people in the cities. Did that remain the case, or did it change as well?
No, it's interesting, because later Mennonitism, if you go for example, into the period of the Dutch Republic, Mennonites were often quite well-to-do people. It seems to have started with an appeal to sort of artisanal classes, laboring classes, the working urban classes. But over time, Mennonitism seems to have spread its reach in sort of all social groups.
Because while the Munster uprising was happening, there were, of course, other uprisings in the Low Countries, in different cities.
Right, yeah. And you have Mennonites in Amsterdam running amok. There's a rebellion in Oldenzaal. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm really curious how we should, if we can imagine this, how we should, if it's the thousands of people that I've seen some projections or some estimates, there were literally thousands of Anabaptist Mennonite, or not yet Mennonites, Anabaptists in different towns in Dutch cities discussing how should we look at that? Should we look at it as rebellion, or again as this impassioned belief in the religion, the religious side of it?
I think it's both and. That is, yes, it's very fiery, passionate faith, but it tends to be coupled with a belief that it's not just enough to reform the inner person or reform the individual sinner, but the whole thing has to be turned upside down, effectively. Again, that revolutionary fervor dies down after Münster happens, but at least in between 1530 and say 1540, there is a very strong kind of radicalism within the Melchiorite Hoffmanite Anabaptism.
let's start talking about the other threads. You do identify three threads in this Reformation in the Low Countries, one being the Anabaptists, which we've touched upon, and then you've got the Reformed Protestants and the Catholics. Let's talk about the Reformed, because often people talk about Protestants, they're thinking of Lutherans or they think just of Luther, but Reformed Protestants is a different tract. Could you tell us the key differences between the two in doctrine and otherwise?
Right. Well, Reformed Protestantism is arose out of Switzerland, first with Huldrych Zwingli in Zurich around 1520, 25 or so. And then and also it included figures like Martin Bucer in Strasbourg. And then a generation later, of course, it gets most famously associated with John Calvin, the French reformer who winds up in Geneva. And in some ways, the differences between Lutheran and Reformed Protestantisms are not particularly vast. But there was one very strong doctrinal sticking point, and that was how to interpret the Eucharist, that is the sacrament of the Mass, where Luther and the Lutherans retained in some ways some Catholic elements about whether Christ, the body of Christ and the blood of Christ were actually present, corporeally present in the elements of the Mass, that is the bread and the wine. And Luther, being the good Catholic that he was, or at least started as, wanted to retain that sense of what was called the real presence in his understanding of how the Eucharist, or what became known as the Lord's Supper, was celebrated. Whereas Zwingli and Calvin and the Reformed tradition saw in the Eucharist a much more symbolic moment, that no, Christ is not corporeally present when the Eucharist is celebrated, but he may well be spiritually present. And that's the big doctrinal difference. There are also differences in sort of style and liturgy. The Reformed tradition tends to be much more sober in its liturgy. They get rid of a lot of imagery in churches, whereas Luther had little difficulty, didn't mind images in churches because he thought they were didactic and educative. So in a sense, what's happening is the Reformed tradition goes a little further in streamlining, in changing the physical ways in which Christians worshiped. Also, I would say the Reformed tradition centers preaching and sermons and the preaching of the Bible much more centrally in its liturgy than the Lutherans did originally. So there are differences of degree, I would say, and I think and again, one particular sticking point on theology, which is how do we understand the Eucharist as well,
which we won't go into too deeply.
No,
so
let's not. It's
not.
complicated. It's interesting to me that the present day Protestant church in the Netherlands, the PKN, is actually, among other things, a fusion of Reformed and Lutheran. It's clearly those differences have been resolved a bit.
Thankfully. We'll be back after this short break. From the 1510s, say, through to the 1540s, there's been a lot of changes and this spread. We've had Anabaptists and the spread of Reformed ideas, and still a very Catholic Habsburg state. You mentioned how the first burning of the heretics in 23 had been a statement. It was them making a real statement. How had their response changed between the 1520s and the 1540s? And if we were an everyday regular person in, say, Antwerp or I'd even venture a little bit further north, how would we have experienced that?
Well, certainly by the middle of the 16th century, the policy of the Habsburgs, first Charles V and then his successor Philip II, is to take a very hard line against heresy. These are loyal Catholic kings. They are not interested in heresy, and the Low Countries are their patrimonial land, so they have a legal free hand to prosecute what they see as very dangerous ideas. So the prosecutions continue. And this legal assault sometimes gets labeled the Inquisition, although technically it's not quite an Inquisition, but it certainly has similarities. And the local cooperation with that Inquisition, which was run by both the church and the Habsburg authorities, the local cooperation varied from place to place. But if you were, say, an ordinary person in Flanders, you could, for example, hear about your neighbors being arrested because they had illicit books. You could hear about people forced to flee because they wanted to escape what they what they feared was judicial suppression. And then occasionally, not all, every day or all the time, uh, you would see people publicly either executed or publicly recanting their Protestant or their dissenting beliefs. If you were a magistrate in a city, you had to watch while your citizens, who technically had the right to be tried only in their own courts, being tried and accused and sometimes killed by what was a fairly new judicial apparatus that local people had no control over. So it's the persecution worked for about between the late 1540s and early 1550s. It seemed to work fairly well to suppress, for example, the various Anabaptist movements, or at least quiet them down. But then by the late 1550s, as the Reformed movement really takes up steam in the Low Countries, it seems as though this legal prosecution is actually working backwards and creating even more resolve, partly because there's a Protestant martyrological tradition that develops out of it, but also because ordinary citizens who otherwise had no sympathy for these heretics are not appreciating what they see as a kind of Habsburg intrusion into what they understood to be their local liberties and privileges. So in the long term, the Habsburg prosecution of heresy initially works fairly well, but in the long term, certainly by the 1560s, it is so unpopular that there is political opposition to the Habsburgs among the nobility, among the magistrates of big cities, that actually has nothing to do with Protestantism, but simply a belief that the traditional privileges and liberties of citizens and of local elites are being bypassed and ignored by this very concerted effort to suppress heresy.
Yeah, well, which is not a pattern uncommon to Low Countries history.
No. Yeah, I mean, the Low Countries, it's this weird conglomeration of a bunch of different sovereignties that are technically under the overlordship of the Habsburgs, but what the Habsburgs learn, and just like their Burgundian predecessors did, was that this was a very hard place to rule. It was very fractious. Authority is decentralized. That there are multiple languages and ethnicities. There's not a lot to unite the region, culturally or linguistically, but it's this accidental collection of territories in the delta of the Rhine and or the delta of the big rivers. And the Habsburgs, their goal is to gain enough control over these territories to be able to, for example, to extract money to pay for their various wars in other parts of the world. And it's an ongoing project. It started with their Burgundian predecessors already in the 14th century, but it's very haphazard. And the Charles V tries very hard to build up state apparatus like a council of finance and a privy council and all the rest. But it doesn't work terribly well. The Habsburgs are a composite state that kind of reached their height of success in the mid by say the 1540s, and then it starts to disintegrate after that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the Catholic Church during all this, because we know, well, you've gone into a bit how the Habsburgs reacted. What changes started to take place with the Catholic Church in that first 3 or 4 decades of the Reformation?
Right. Well, I often people ask, I got some questioning when this book came out. Why are you talking about Catholics? I said, well, Reformation, religious change is something that affects the Catholic Church too. The overwhelming majority of Netherlanders and Europeans, for that matter, stay with the Catholic Church, right? But and so we have to consider them, and the Catholic Church. You have to understand, since its beginnings, has had a long tradition throughout the Middle Ages of reforming itself, right? Sometimes in some periods more successfully than others. I think what happens certainly in the church in the Low Countries in the middle of the 16th century is that they realize just how much there is a kind of popular sentiment, popular support for religious change. And so the Catholic Church in the Low Countries, the prelacy, the bishops, in cooperation with the Habsburg government, try to introduce meaningful reform and change. Certainly by the late 1550s, the 1560s, what the Catholic Church sees in the Reformation is a failure of the clergy. That is, that somehow their priesthood, had failed to tend to the souls of Christians, and therefore many Christians, not all of them, strayed away. And so the whole Catholic Reformation process, the whole impetus behind Catholic reform, like the Council of Trent, for example, is to try and make pastoral care better. So you get things like they set up seminaries, right? It was not necessary for a priest to go to seminary before the Reformation, but with the Reformation, bishops are required to set up seminaries in their diocese for the proper training of priests. New religious orders are introduced in the Low Countries, like most especially the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, which first shows up in Leuven in the 1540s. And the whole point, and then particularly in the Netherlandish case in 1559, there was a reorganization of the bishoprics of the Low Countries, of the diocesan organization or structure of the Low Countries, that is designed, at least in part, to introduce these changes and these improvements in the church, but also it's a Habsburg project to try and increase their power over the church and their cooperation with the church. So it's not like the Catholic Church is standing idle and watching all this happen. They are working very hard in various institutional ways to bring about the reform of the church. But the problem from their point of view is that some folks have, some people have already been lost to what they understand to be heresy. But the other challenge is to make sure that those who are loyal and remain will continue to do so. I mean, it's a very new problem in some ways for the Catholic Church. I mean, it's dealt with heresy before, but never quite with such successful heresy, at least not in a long time.
That then brings us to the year 1566, the so-called Wonder Year. Should we talk about it? Tell us what happened in 1566 and how did it spark what became military conflict?
In April of 1566, the very heavy-handedness of the Inquisition, of the legal prosecution of dissenters, prompts or causes some members of the Netherlandish gentry, not the top nobles, but the sort of second-rank ones, to issue a formal protest to Margaret of Parma, who is the Governor General of the Low Countries, effectively the regent for her half-brother Philip II. And those nobles, some of whom are Protestant, but some of whom are not, are presenting a petition, basically a protest saying this Inquisition, as they called it, is destroying the country. It's alienating the people. It's causing disruption, and it needs to come to an end. So this particular issue aspect of Habsburg religious policy is what sparks the whole thing. So Margaret of Parma effectively suspends some of the legal prosecution and allows, or at least maybe not allow, not actively allow, but certainly allows Protestant groups to start meeting and worshiping more openly. And the reform movement, which by 1566 is certainly the most dynamic of all of the dissenting movements in the Low Countries, takes that opportunity and runs with it. They demand in various localities the right to worship openly. In some cases, in some cities, for example, in Flanders, they ask for a building where they can start to worship. In other words, there's fairly open worship going on, and some of that worship is also happening out in the countryside, in outside of city gates, where you have these mass hedge preachings, where some reform pastor preaches to 5,000 people at a time, outside the gates of Antwerp. You start to see more and more reformed Netherlanders become very emboldened by what they see as a kind of freeing of the legal circumstances to start worshiping pretty openly. And Margaret Parp is not happy about this, and certainly neither is Philip II. But that's the situation on the ground. And then it gets exaggerated or exacerbated in August of 1566, when a group of Reformed Protestants attack a chapel outside the village of Steenvoorde in far western Flanders, and they attack the religious images in the chapel. They smash the altar to bits. They engage in a fair amount of destruction, and there's a chain reaction. And for about the next 2 months, this iconoclastic fury, what's in Dutch called the Beeldenstorm, spreads through virtually the whole Low Countries, right? From West Flanders up to Groningen, from Maastricht to Amsterdam. And it's this wave of violence against churches, not so much violence against clergy, which is interesting, but violence against images in churches, whether those were altarpieces or statuary or elaborate candelabras. Now, it varied from place to place. In some places, it was clearly a kind of organized thing. In other places, it was spontaneous. In some places, it happened with the connivance of local authorities or local militias, but in other cases, it didn't. And then there are whole regions that avoid it entirely, like Brussels never has a destruction of images, nor does Leuven. So it varied from place to place, but it was deeply shocking to contemporaries because it was this attack on the churches, right? People are throwing their shoes at statues of saints, and they're drinking the sacramental wine. I mean, there's mockery and desecration everywhere. It's really deeply shocking to contemporaries. And Margaret of Parma, who's supposed to be in charge, is under tremendous pressure from her half brother Philip II back in Spain to put a lid on it. So the iconoclastic fury ends up having the effect of forcing the Habsburgs to once again take a very heavy hand towards religious dissent. I mean, to the extent of using armed force. And so that by 1567, for example, within half a year of the iconoclastic fury of the Wonder Year, our Margaret of Parma is sending troops to places like Valenciennes and Tournai and Antwerp, and trying to suppress the rebellion. And that's when war breaks out.
And how did that war then, which proceeded obviously for the next 8 decades, but how did that go hand in hand with Reformed Protestantism in those early days and then eventually?
Well, initially, the political leadership, that is the nobles who led the political opposition to the Habsburgs, they enter into an alliance with the Reformed or the religious opposition, shall we say. Both political and religious opponents, starting in 1567, have to flee into exile, mostly to the Holy Roman Empire, because there's a new regime, the Duke of Alba, and the Duke of Alba wants everybody's head who is a rebel. So now suddenly in exile, these political opponents have to break bread with and deal with religious opponents. And, not all the political opponents are Protestants, that they tend to see these Calvinists as pretty wild-eyed revolutionaries. But they have to make common cause with each other because that's about the only way they think that they can muster any sort of opposition. And at the head of all of this, trying to orchestrate it all, is poor William of Orange, who was raised a Lutheran and then became a Catholic so he could become the leading noble of the Low Countries. And his own personal religious convictions are fairly lukewarm and open-minded, but here he is trying to negotiate and navigate what was a really contentious coalition of opponents to the Habsburg regime. But they do make common cause with each other, and then in 1572, more or less accidentally, some rebel troops gain a toehold in Holland, and then Zeeland, and then suddenly, well, not suddenly, but when rebels take over parts of the country, then Reformed Protestants follow them and start instituting religious change. So it's a tangled relationship because the political opposition is made up of both Protestants and Catholics, whereas the religious opposition is virulently anti-Catholic, and wants to see not just simply let's get rid of the Habsburgs, or let's get rid of the Habsburg yoke, but let's get rid of the Catholic Church as well. All right, and that makes for a very uneasy coalition that eventually, by the late 1570s, breaks down.
Yeah, just cannot sustain that. Well, especially with William the Silent having, like you said, raised Lutheran, converted to Catholicism. Also, well, lukewarm, I think, is how you put his religious beliefs. How did that, and his sense of a freedom of conscience, how did that go into shaping these early stages of the Netherlandish state, becoming multi-confessional, which it ultimately did?
Well, I wouldn't describe that to William of Orange more specifically, but I think instead certainly by the time we get to an independent Dutch Republic in the 1580s, there is a widespread kind of assumption about freedom of conscience. And to a certain extent, yes, William of Orange inspired it because he tried very hard to broker various religious peaces in the regions that he conquered so that Protestants and Catholics could worship side by side. And those don't work because the Protestants absolutely insist on taking over all the public religious space. But I think one of the reasons why we have a kind of multi-confessional society where freedom of conscience is actually more or less enshrined in law in the Dutch Republic is precisely because of the experiences of the 16th century with persecution, with war. The men who end up ruling the Dutch Republic, who are mostly urban, city magistrates in Holland, they conclude that coercion, that forcing religious coercion, is just simply not worth the price. That it's all very nice to have unity and harmony and everybody believing the same thing, but to get to that point, by the 1580s, then that's trying to put the genie back in the bottle, and it's not going to work. And so they opt instead to sort of manage religious coexistence rather than try to undo it.
So by the time we get to the 1580s, we have different confessionals in across the Low Countries, but Protestants and rebels are starting to make a bit more of an impact. And the Spanish, of course, reconquer parts of the southern Low Countries in the 1580s.
Right.
Can you talk about how this changed the demographics and the structure of things a little bit?
Sure. So in the 1580s, the Habsburg armies, led mostly by Alexander Farnese, who was the son of Margaret of Parma, he is successfully able in the 1580s to take back pretty large chunks of the Low Countries that had fallen under rebel hands, particularly most of Flanders and most of Brabant, which were the two key core provinces of the Low Countries.
Just to interrupt, how much of the Low Countries had fallen into Protestant hands up until that point?
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, the dates are a little variable. Yeah, but let's say roughly what's from Groningen southwestward to Flanders and Brabant, most of those provinces So sort of what would you call it? The northwestern half of the Low Countries had come under some degree of rebel control. Right? That was still pretty shaky and wobbly, but that wasn't going to stop the Protestants from trying to introduce Reformation. What happens in the 1580s is Alexander Farnese successfully leads the reconquest of Brabant and Flanders. That's really his big achievement. So, and thereby, in the long term, creating what becomes known as the Kingdom of Belgium.
Yeah, and so that's the divide that we still live with today, and
Yeah.
the immediate effects of that and the long term effects. Could you go into a little bit?
Well, the immediate effect was, so in 1585, Farnese reconquers Antwerp, which had been in rebel hands, and this kind of capstones a triumphant Reconquista by the Habsburgs. And there are lots of Protestants still living in Flanders and Brabant when it goes back under Habsburg control. And ultimately, what Farnese and the Habsburg government tells these people is either you convert to Catholicism or you leave. And about 150,000 people opt to leave. That is, they migrate from the southern Netherlands, mostly to the north, to what will become the Dutch Republic. Some of them go to England, some of them go to the Holy Roman Empire. Most of them are Protestants, but not necessarily all. A lot of them are economic migrants who just want to get away from the war as well. But there's this massive shift of population, and a lot of those people took, their capital, their talent, their labor with them, and they are fully installed in the cities of the Dutch Republic, especially in Holland and Zeeland and Utrecht, where they contribute to this enormous economic flowering that, of course, the Dutch Republic will enjoy in the 17th century. So it's a big change, but also the more obvious, and there'll be, more decades worth of fighting, but ultimately the frontier is pretty well established. And so, the sort of big long-term result is that there are two states. Right? There is the Habsburg or Archducal Netherlands in the south, and there is this new state, the Dutch Republic. And that's novel about the Reformation in the Low Countries. Nowhere else does it change the political map of Europe. Right? It creates an entirely new country.
So the South stays under the Habsburg control and remains Catholic.
Or it's remade Catholic. Let's put it that way. I mean, it's, yeah.
And despite the over 100,000 people who leave, were there people who remained behind? And I think the term that you used is Nicodemism. So could you explain that a little bit? And if there were people that stayed?
Yeah. There were Protestants who opted to stay in the southern Netherlands, even though this was a Catholic confessional regime, and even though they were often persecuted. They're not very numerous, but we find evidence of them mostly in the cities and mostly in Flanders and Brabant, although not exclusively. There's a few in the French-speaking South as well, but they are a small group. And they are to some extent a persecuted minority, and they kind of retreat into their own communities. So that one could arguably say, well, the Southern Netherlands really is a very successfully re-Catholicized country. I mean, there are handfuls of Protestants here and there, but they are not a big group. In some ways, Catholic Reformation really succeeds in the South.
And how did that take place, the Catholic Reformation? What was the process of that in the South? What did it look like?
Well, it was a combination of efforts by ordinary lay Catholics, the Church, the Catholic Church, but also the Habsburg government, the Archdukes Albert and Isabella, who ruled the Low Countries, who ruled the Southern Netherlands on behalf of the Philip III. The three of them worked in concert. These three different groups worked in concert with each other to try and re-Catholicize the Low Countries. And part of it, the motivation for that partly is, a big chunk of it is just people wanted to get back to normal lives, right? the 1570s and 1580s, it'd been nothing but warfare, and most of that fighting was in Flanders and Brabant. And so part of it is just a desire among ordinary people to say, okay, we've had enough. We've had enough conflict. We are loyal to the church, and so we are going to build the church back. But this required a lot of work because buildings are destroyed, churches are destroyed, monasteries are destroyed. So the church has to, and the Habsburg government have to work together to try and subsidize the rebuilding of parishes. They introduce new religious orders. The Jesuits are there, the Capuchins. In other words, there's this effort that's very collective. It's not just simply the Habsburgs imposing this from above. There's ordinary lay Catholics are saying, let us restore our country, let us restore the church, let us restore our spiritual fabric. And so it was just sheer physical construction. It's very conscientious bishops trying to find the right people to become clergy. It's religious orders like the Jesuits who are actively encouraging local lay Catholics to express their devotion, right? In other words, it's kind of an effort to go back to that early 16th century Catholicism that had been so vibrant and so lively, but now in slightly newer bottles, shall we say, of where, okay, we've learned the lesson that if we don't do this right, what we get is rebellion, right? So it's a process that everybody really in the South is involved in.
Well, and it seems to have been quite effective.
Mm,
So could you then, because we're going to look at the North in a second, but
okay,
that was very disparate, lots of different groups. We're going
right.
to talk about that. They had the background of the unified church and empire in this effort in the South. Did that help that they could actually get everyone on the same page, so to speak?
Sure. Oh, yeah, because the leadership of the Southern Netherlands, this archducal government, the Habsburg government, deliberately embarked on a policy of re-Catholicization. Right. In other words, they choose for the Catholic confession. Right. And so the Southern or archducal Netherlands can be seen as a confessional state where political authorities and church authorities work very closely with each other to make sure that there's more or less spiritual uniformity. Right. So yeah, no, this is deliberate policy. But again, also with the pretty enthusiastic participation of normal people on the ground too. Right. It's people want an end to war. And and again, most Netherlanders are, they don't become heretics. They don't become Protestants. And it's almost as if the silent majority gets to work in the southern Netherlands and says, okay, let's re-Catholicize and reestablish our spiritual identity.
In the North, we have schisms still happening.
Mhm.
The Reformed Church is the only public church.
Right.
There is a difference in different villages and towns as to how much of other confessions are being allowed by the different
Right.
magistrates. But in the public church, there is a big schism, the Arminius Gomarus debate.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about that, please, and how it was resolved?
Sure. Well, it breaks out officially in 1609 when Arminius, who was a theology professor at Leiden, uh, produced a theological tract that argued for a greater role for good works in the process of salvation, and a greater role than most of his colleagues in the theology faculty were comfortable with, especially Gomarus. And so you get this theological schism or this theological conflict in the University of Leiden. It starts out as this kind of ivory tower debate, but it very quickly spills into wider social and political debates about how to prosecute the war against the Habsburgs. And various politicians get involved, including Johann van Oldenbarneveld, who supports the Arminians, and the Stadtholder Maurice of Nassau, who supports the Gomarists. And the religious the theological conflict basically bleeds into a big political and social debate about how this war should be prosecuted, and there are pamphlets hurled right and left. There are riots. People get very, very head up on this. And the end result is that Maurice of Nassau and the Gomarists, or the sort of people who styled themselves as Orthodox Calvinists, take over the public church and also take over the government of the Dutch Republic and expel these dissenters. And it makes for, this terrible moment in the very early history of the Dutch Republic, where they are fighting each other over what the future course of the country should be. And it has a ripple effect on all the non-reformed citizens of the Dutch Republic, who are very happy to see those Protestants, fight each other. And for them, it just simply confirms their suspicions all along that these people, just don't know what they're doing, or at least are wrong.
So how does it come to a head, if you don't mind me saying?
Well, it's probably in 1617 and 1618. By then, the real focus of the tension is between Oldenbarneveld and Maurice of Nassau. And Oldenbarneveld is basically the head, you might say the prime minister of Holland. He's the land's advocate. And he tries very hard to put together a coalition of Holland politicians that will be able to resist Maurice's efforts to gain more power. But the trouble is, Holland was only one of 6 provinces that made up the Dutch Republic, and the political sentiment in nearly all the other provinces was for the Gomarists and resented the dominance of Holland. So, in the end, Oldenbarneveld, he tries to negotiate and broker an end to the conflict, but ultimately, what ends up happening is Maurice of Nassau just takes troops and takes over the cities of Holland, gets rid of Oldenbarneveld. He's eventually executed, purges the government of Holland of any Arminians, and then the Dutch Reformed Church has a big synod in 1618 and 19, a national synod at Dordrecht, where after about 7 months of deliberations, they expel effectively the Arminian faction within the church, which was always a minority. They expel them out of the church.
We are running out of time, so I'm just going to ask one more question. This was a huge, huge process of development for both the Netherlands and Belgium today. Why does it still matter for us today? So a lot of people in these countries don't identify with theological aspects of it. When we talk about the Eucharistic squabbles, it's very hard to connect to for a lot. But can you tell us why it matters for us today?
Well, I mean, I often say, if there were no Reformation in the Low Countries, there would be no modern states of the Netherlands and Belgium. So, even if one is entirely indifferent to religion, it was in fact problems of religious change and how to deal with it that effectively end up creating 2 states that still exist today. And Belgium at least has been historically very Catholic, if not necessarily currently, and the Kingdom of the Netherlands has always been very pluralistic. So I think the lesson that you take from it is that just because it's something that you don't believe in doesn't mean it's not going to have an effect on how you live. Also, I think the other lesson of the Low Countries, the Reformation in Low Countries, is just how much war and violence can attend these kinds of events, these kinds of changes. I mean, religious war, we all like to think of that as something, back from, 300 years ago, but we still continue to see the power of ideas and ideologies in conflicts today, right? And some of those ideas are religious or theological. So I think it's good for for states to understand what their origins are. In some ways, the Netherlands and Belgium, these modern states, they're accidental, right? They were created out of a peculiar set of historical circumstances, and it's good for anyone to remember, or to at least know what the circumstances were behind that. I mean, again, these are fully secular societies, and so they're not going to have religious debates. Although I would argue that some of the sort of present day public discussion about a Muslim minority, for example, in both Belgium and the Netherlands. You can hear echoes of that in the religious debates of the 16th century. So, yeah, the place of belief in a society is actually, I think, greater than sometimes is given credence to. And it doesn't necessarily mean religious belief so much, perhaps, as a set of ideas that you believe very strongly in. Ideas have great power, and they for good and for ill, I would say.
Beautifully put. Christine Kooi, thank you so much. Your book has helped us a lot and will remain a valuable resource for us as we carry on with our work. And we just want to thank you for joining us here today.
You are most welcome, and thank you very much for hosting me. I always like the opportunity to be able to talk about this.
Do you want to know more about Flemish and Dutch history and culture? Visit www.the-low-countries.com. This podcast is made by Republic of Amsterdam Radio.